Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Dustin Sable. I'm the director of youth and young adults here at Scioto Ridge. When I took my homiletics, my preaching classes in college, my professor said, if you're ever worried that you're not going to do a good job, tell the congregation that, and at the very least, they might be a little nicer to you. If I'm honest, I'm a little shaken up with all the news this morning, so if you'd be gracious to me, I'd appreciate that. But I want to start this morning by also talking about a little bit of a vulnerable story from my life. Right after I graduated from grad school, I ended up taking a job as a house parent at a rehab for teenage boys recovering from opioid abuse. It's okay if you think I'm a hero. The job was hard. It was really hard, but it was also super fulfilling. I got to walk alongside these young men as they wrestled with trauma and addiction and all the normal difficulties of growing up. We worked with nonviolent drug offenders, and it was a beautiful experience to feel like you were making an impact. But as I was working there, about 6 months into the program, we started making some subtle changes due to some changes in the Indiana guidelines. To survive as an organization, we would have to begin admitting more teens with assault and battery charges. We received some more training, and we were assured things wouldn't change all that much. Now, working with teenage boys, let alone teenage boys going through withdrawals, it shouldn't be surprising that in the first 6 months, I had to break up a handful of fights. You know, it was part of the job. And for me, it was part of the healing process for these young men. But as the program changed, so did the dynamics in the house. What went from breaking up a fight every few weeks went to breaking up fights just about every single day. And while most of the boys, unfortunately, were behind several years in school, they would throw insults at me that couldn't be crafted by Shakespeare himself. So slowly, barely even noticing it, I felt rising in me a slow trickle of anger. I slowly became more and more frustrated with the daily inconveniences of working with the boys, increasingly maddened at the insults and breaking up fights, and I knew that I probably needed to do something with this anger, but I didn't. I let it boil inside of me unaddressed. At the time, there were two particular boys who so deeply knew how to get under my skin, picking apart at all of my insecurities one by one. And without realizing it, eventually I no longer wanted what was best for them. If I'm truly honest, I wanted them to suffer, to be punished for the pain that they were putting me through. For so long, I had ignored my anger and suppressed its cries to be heard that it began to corrode my soul. I looked at myself in the mirror, and the person that anger turned me into, I no longer recognized. My friends, today we're moving into a new section of the Sermon on the Mount. Over the next few weeks, 6 times we'll hear from Jesus, "You've heard it said, but I say to you." And each time, Jesus will pair an old teaching from the Torah, the law, with a new teaching from himself. We're going to dive right into our passage today. It's from Matthew 5, verses 21 through 22. It's page 786 in our Pew Bibles. Jesus starts this section by saying this: "You have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, 'You shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment.' But I say to you, if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or sister, you will be liable to the council. And if you say, 'You fool,' You will be liable to the hell of fire. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. It's hard to say it, right? Sometimes. Some of you might be questioning this passage for a variety of reasons. If you're anything like me, at first glance, this passage might freak you out. As a kid, I remember being scared by any passage that mentioned the word hell, but a passage like this might literally give me nightmares. I'm not a temperamentally angry guy, but I definitely can get angry from time to time. And there certainly have been times where I've used my language to insult or hurt others. Some other of you in the room might be wondering how this relates to the anger that we feel when we read the news or we hear the pain of the suffering of others. Is Jesus saying that we shouldn't be angry about war or hunger or injustice? Still, others of you might be wondering, well, what do we do with our anger then? Maybe some of you have been taught to repress your anger, not to rock the boat, but you know that hasn't been working. So the two questions I want to explore with us this morning are, what is Jesus calling us to do about our anger? And why is Jesus even talking about this in the first place? Well, we probably should start by talking about what kind of anger Jesus is addressing here. Anger is one of those words that belong to a whole family of emotions. Is Jesus talking about a flash of frustration? Is he talking about being in a fit of rage? Is he talking about resentment or contempt or hate? Well, we're going to get really nerdy here for just a second. So if this was a YouTube video, you can just skip forward about 30 seconds. Bear with me. In English, the word anger is typically used as a noun or an adjective, angry. But in Greek here, it's a verb. And we don't really have the exact precise language to neatly say this in English. But what's happening in this passage is somewhere along the lines of, when you are angry and continue to be angry, or when you stay angry with a brother or sister, you are liable to judgment. If we were to translate this as literally as possible, it would be something like this. Angry-ing, verb, a perpetual state of anger. Jesus is talking about a posture of anger here. This isn't necessarily the feeling of being cut off on the highway and slamming on your horn. If it was, I think a lot of people in Columbus would definitely be in trouble. I think what Jesus is talking about here is what happens when we leave that emotion unchecked and unattended to. When hours later, we're still brewing about how awful that person was. Anger, like all of our emotions, can be a gift. Emotions are like messengers that give us crucial information about our internal world and about what we value. Anger helps clue us in to potential violations against what we really care about. And as Christians, we're even instructed to be angry in certain situations, like when the innocent are mistreated or the poor are oppressed. Both Psalms and Ephesians explicitly instruct us to be angry, but not to sin in our anger. So what I think Jesus is talking about here is the danger of what happens when our anger is left unchecked, unresponded to, and unheard. The type of anger we let fester into what we might call resentment or contempt or even hate. And we see just this. In the next few verses, we see how unchecked anger can spiral out of control. That internal, repressed anger slowly starts revealing itself in insults, negative comments, gossip. Oh, did you hear this about so-and-so? Oh, yeah, they're the worst. Then Jesus says, oftentimes we let our anger fester even further, and it can result in devastating insults like, you fool. I don't know about you, but I've definitely been called worse than you fool. At first glance, the insult, you fool, doesn't sound that bad, but I knew there was probably something more going on there. So I looked into the Greek, and I found the word moros. It's the same word we get moron from all these years later. And when I looked at the Bible dictionaries, one defined moros like this: empty-headed and morally bankrupt. Another simply said, empty, worthless. See how quickly we've already moved from a moment of frustration to angry-ing that we let fester, and then we're insulting and gossiping, and eventually we've gotten to a point where we're comfortable thinking and calling someone worthless. What I think Jesus is talking about here is when we allow our anger to strip other human beings of dignity. When our anger causes us to think of our brothers and sisters as less than ourselves. Because once you've convinced yourself that your enemy is less than human, you've already justified treating them however you want. Famous couples therapist John Gottman says this about contempt. Contempt, simply put, says, I'm better than you, and you are lesser than me. He goes on to say that contempt is perhaps the most corrosive force in relationships. And Jesus seems to agree. He uses incredibly strong language to talk about the devastating consequences of our unchecked anger. Over 3 examples, he paints a picture of the social fabric of a community being torn apart. As we move from anger to insults to full dehumanization, Jesus ups the seriousness of each action. From a local court, the same ones that would handle murder cases, to the Sanhedrin, the high court that would take only the most serious crimes, to hell. Now, a quick note here on hell, because if you're anything like me, you hear that word and the hair on the back of your neck sticks up. When we hear about hell, most of our minds go to something along the lines of Dante's Inferno. But when Jesus talks about hell, like in this passage, he's often naming a real physical place on earth called Gehenna. If your Bibles are still open, go to that word in the passage that says hell. You'll see a little G there. Now, if you go down to the bottom of your page, you'll see another G there, and next to it, it says Gehenna. The Bible is telling us what word specifically Jesus is using there. Now, back in Israel's darkest days, Gehenna in the valley of Hinnom, just outside of Jerusalem, was the place where child sacrifices occurred. And in Jesus' day, it was Jerusalem's landfill, perpetually on fire, burning up their trash. It wasn't a place you wanted to be. So, if you ever meet someone in Columbus from Gehenna, you now have a really fun fact to share with them. No, but seriously, Jesus is invoking a very specific image in the ears of his listeners. Gehenna, hell, is what happens when we take things into our own hands, when we define justice according to our own desires, when we are so comfortable dehumanizing others, we find it within ourselves to sacrifice even children. I said this before. Gehenna is quite literally hell on earth. And Jesus says that is the path that our unchecked anger leads us down. And we've seen this in the modern age too, haven't we? Jesus so insightfully shows us the connection between anger and dehumanization and how that can lead to devastating consequences. We don't have to try hard to imagine what this looks like at a societal scale. If we think about the atrocities of our modern age, they don't come from nowhere. They're always preceded by dehumanizing language. Governments using language like rats and vermin and cockroaches about their enemies. That is what they use to justify horrific things. And Jesus roots all of that in our repressed anger. But I think eventually that leads us to the question, what do we actually do with our anger? And to begin exploring that, I think we have to look at why Jesus is talking about the commandment not to murder in the first place. About 1,000 years earlier, God leads his people out of slavery from the dust of Egypt, and he brings them to the base of Mount Sinai. And having been saved, God gives his people an opportunity to respond, to be God's people, a nation of priests, holy and set apart. What does that look like? Well, God gives them 613 commandments about how to be a different kind of people in their particular context. Now, odds are most of us here couldn't pick most of these 613 laws out of a lineup, but I'm guessing that most of us would know at least 10. The first 10, the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments serve as a kind of summary of everything that's going to come after. What you may or may not have noticed about the 10 Commandments is that the first 4 address Israel's relationship with God, and the second 6 address their relationship with one another. All these commands are rooted in 2 radical ideas: that God, Yahweh, alone is worthy of worship, and that everybody, all of us, as a Southerner might say, all y'all, are made in the image of God. For Jesus, the commandment not to murder is great, but it's not simply a rule to check off a list, a binary, did I or did I not murder today? It points us toward a deeper reality that everyone, all y'all, are made in the image of God. So instead of pointing to an external rule, Jesus challenges us with a renovation of our hearts, our very desires. Because murder just doesn't happen on its own, in a vacuum. It comes at the end of a very long road that's rooted in the same desires and impulses to treat our enemies as less than ourselves. And I think all of that makes sense. I think that's a really beautiful sentiment from Jesus. We've tackled the what and the why, but what I'm still wrestling with is the how. How do we deal with our anger in a way that honors God and honors our shared humanity, while also honors the cries of pain that come from our hearts, begging to be expressed? Let's return to Matthew 5 and see what Jesus has to say. We're going to start with verse 23. So, when you're offering your gift at the altar, if you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother or sister, and then come offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you're on the way to court with him. Or your accuser may hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you will be thrown into prison. Truly, I tell you, you will never get out until you've paid the last penny. Reconciliation. Now that's a hard word. And again, I want to be honest with you. I've really been wrestling with this week because I think it's a lot harder in practice than it sounds. And that maybe is just the point. What Jesus does here is he impresses on us the seriousness and the urgency of reconciliation, but he doesn't quite show us how, at least not here. And maybe that's the point. Perhaps it's because there is no one-size-fits-all reconciliation. But maybe here's a few pieces of advice. I think the first thing we need to do is to name our anger. It's difficult. Many of us here have been taught not to feel our anger, but that doesn't help anyone. Anger always finds a way out. So 2 questions that I think are helpful here, and these will be in your bulletins, is 1, is my anger causing me to see or treat its recipient as less than a child of God? And 2, what is holding on to this anger doing to my soul? Like when I was working at the rehab, is holding on to this anger turning you into a person you don't recognize anymore? Next, maybe we explore how we can express that anger in a healthy way. Jesus shows us not how to express our anger. Maybe it's holding it before God in prayer. Maybe it's writing in a journal some kind of lament like the psalmists do. Maybe it's talking through it with a mentor or pastor or therapist. What are healthy outlets for us to honor and acknowledge that emotion without letting it have control over us? And now it's here that I think things start to get really hard. The actual reconciliation part. I think the first thing that we have to remember here is that Jesus puts the responsibility for reconciliation on the perpetrator. If you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there at the altar and go. First, be reconciled to them, and then come and offer your gift. And this is a serious thing. Worship in the temple at the altar was the pinnacle of worship for the Israelites. But Jesus says here, that act of worship to God is inherently tied to how we treat our neighbor. So, if you realize that you've wronged someone, Jesus challenges us to do what we need to do to make it right. And as far as it's up to us, be reconciled. This should be the goal for our Christian community. Reconciliation and restored relationships. Not perpetuating the cycle of violence and dehumanization, but also not retreating into a cold anger and breaking off relationships before we have the chance to engage with hard conversations. At the same time, though, some relationships just can't be reconciled. Reconciliation takes active participation, honesty, and humility from all parties involved. And sometimes that's just not possible. Maybe it's not safe, or there's unwillingness, or maybe the person that you harbor that anger toward is someone you'll never meet. And I want to be honest with you. That sucks. In situations like this, you probably have more than a right to be angry. Sometimes your anger is telling you exactly what you need to hear. It's telling you that something sacred was violated, that a boundary was crossed, an injustice occurred, and that anger matters. But what Jesus is urging us to do here is not to let that anger turn another image bearer or ourselves into something less than human. There are probably some of us that need to make a phone call and apologize to someone this week. I'm one of those people. There are probably some of us who need to hold on to a boundary, but also release the contempt that's slowly been killing us. And that's really hard work. But Jesus says it's also sacred work too. It's a small part in bringing more of that kingdom shalom, that full and overflowing peace that we've been talking about. You know, we don't go to Jerusalem to make sacrifices in a temple. But in a moment, we're going to invite everyone to come forward and participate in Holy Communion as we wrestle with the beautiful and mysterious grace that God offers to us in Jesus. Jesus, who had every right to be angry, but instead chose the path of forgiveness and love instead. So before we do that, I think to prepare, I want to invite us into a minute or two of silence. God desires that we would be united to him through Jesus by the power of his Spirit. But God also desires that we might be one as well. So we're going to take a moment to reflect on where God might be inviting you to reconcile, maybe to express anger, or to let it go, or maybe even just taking the first step and naming it. May it be so.